And I think one of the things that I've been particularly interested in and where we've focused some of the attention is moving away from perhaps the more historical idea that the data feeds into the models in a single direction, and that actually there's a kind of a cyclical pattern where the data needs to feed into the models, but then the models and the estimation process then need to inform what data we need, what perhaps are the interesting things that we still need to collect in order to constrain parameters better, or areas of the model that might be deficient that extra data might actually help in understanding or improving. And that very much matches with Frank then, do we have the ability then to go to the data collectors and inform them about what we would like them to collect, whereas perhaps they have a more rigid process or a kind of set of data or forms that they have to fill in for the data collection, and maybe they're not, particularly when the pressure's on, whether they're able to be flexible enough to start collecting new data for us if we need it.
Yeah, I mean that's very much one of the things that have come out is how, as the kind of horizons have expanded as to the classes of data that might be material in enhancing or improving models. Yeah, that is very much a process, a cyclical process, as you say. I think that's a really good point.
Hi. So
Jasmine, yes.
Hi, hello. So
Hi.
I also have been very heavily involved with the modeling, and I'm involved with the estimation paper. So I have been working on sort of infectious disease modeling for a while, in a sense of using the sort of scarce data and using more complex data, and understanding the balance between when you have sufficient amount of data and a complex model that sort of buffers the missing data, or you have enough data and a simple model that averages things and gives you. So it's the balance between those two that I think it's a challenge that we've in real time dealt with in this pandemic, and something to acknowledge. So different models may require different data, and then this data needs to be replenished, as Ben said, as we go along. The point that Frank was making about the availability of data, again, I really second that, because and really echo that, because you can have, and I have experience where you ask for the data, it goes through the whole ethics process, and then you get the wrong data, and then it's this sort of forward and back conversation about, I need this, I need this, and by that time you are quite discouraged to do the work by the time the data arrives 6 months later. I think what we've seen in this pandemic is more collaborative data sharing, and one aspect that is we should think as a massive challenge is producing what the Turing Institute calls data lakes, which is from where the data can be used up, or a data pool from where with certain agreements the data can be used. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does indeed. I mean, there's an interesting other approach which Ben Goldacre was presenting, which was the kind of how you can take the safe enclave model and do a lot more with it, in terms of data linkage and actually submitting your models into the data, having trialed the model against
a dummy data set.
Yes, exactly. Synthetic or variously modified data, and then you're assured that the model will run, and then you submit it behind the firewall, so to say. And that's generated some really interesting insights, a different model in a way, which comes with its own challenges of governance, of course, and accessibility. That's nice. Glenn, yeah.
Just to ask, is there a document we are looking at, or we are just talking?
No, we're talking at this stage. There could be a document shortly. I was going to say we might want to sort of start to how you find the best way to construct this, Valerie and Dennis. You be guided by you. You've done this.
Well, some noble soul puts together a starting point of summarising the discussion, I think. Right. And then what, once one's got started, everybody can chip in and add to it. But
I'm taking notes, Valerie, so I'm happy to do that initial starting document for you all.
That would be wonderful, Kira, if you don't mind. And we are recording this, so there will be that as a sort of a memoir for anybody.
So, Frank, I was just going to say, Chiara's shared on the chat the pointer to the DELV report. So DELV was the Data Evaluation, Learning and something else or whatever initiative of the Royal Society. And it did a lot of kind of data science type things and produced 7 reports altogether. The last of the reports it produced is this one, Data Readiness. Now, and so it looked at, I mean, it was typical, DELV was typically looking at questions that were coming to it from SAGE. And it wasn't particularly looking at the epidemiological questions. That is the questions that perhaps the people in the Newton Institute were mainly focused on. I mean, it was viewed as there's lots of data people there and lots of modelers there, so that isn't particularly the place to look. But it was looking at other things, and that this data readiness report is a summary of the lessons that the DELV group felt were learnt from their experience.
Yes, that's right, and I referred to that earlier. That is it's quite helpful, I think. We shouldn't just be captured by the whole thing, but as you say, I think that contextualization is an interesting one, though, Frank, about what they were responding to and what they were trying to be, what they were trying to kind of do.
I compare it with Jasmina's comments. I mean, for example, the construction of a data lake or the structures that Ben Goldacre describes. Those things are just tremendous, and we should absolutely do those. But they tend to be in areas where you know that there's a problem. Every year you're going to want to look at GP records and health records, and you know that you have this as a problem to continuously solve. And I suppose the question is, suppose something new happens. It could be a pandemic, but it might well be some other kind of emergency. It may well be, who knows, on the government's.
Sure. I mean, I think the point with open safety, with that, is that we've known that those linkages were really important sources of insight, and it took this particular situation to really construct the institutional and collective will to kind of produce a solution. And so I think there are important things to. I mean, you've got to imagine that connecting the primary and secondary health data records in that way is going to turn out to be quite useful in a lot of contexts. But you're right, I guess imagining future contexts and where we can look for, if you like, the data requirements about what people are imagining the next set of challenges might be. Just in terms of the cross linkages to other papers, we've got obviously 2 representatives from one of the groups there. Are there, and the policy one we've talked about, are there other obvious places which are they all more or less data intensive, or are there things that in the future context would be particularly useful to look at? I mean, Dennis suggests we look at the chapter headings anyway and just get a sense of how they're organized, theme headings.
What we've been saying is that it's more important to avoid missing things than to avoid overlap. So, so we're encouraging groups to include things, but equally a little bit further down the line, when most of the groups at least have got their provisional titles for challenges, that will be a good opportunity to have a sort of a data sweep across the draft papers, and just and if it's the case that someone in modeling is considering writing pretty much exactly the same as you're considering writing under data, or indeed someone under interventions is thinking of writing something that you're then obviously you can have a discussion as to whether to either make sure you phrase them as coming at the same kind of thing from a different point of view, which could be useful, or whether actually you want to join forces and allocate it to one paper or the other.
And just for the cross-reference.
Or whether just cross-referring is the sensible thing. So and in that spirit of openness, you're very welcome to look at the drop, what is in the other drop boxes, and in most cases I'm trying to keep that fairly clean so that as we go along, so that there is something that's fairly identifiable as being the latest draft there. So for instance, looking at one of the most complicated ones at the moment, which is the modelling one, you'll find there are which is number 6, you'll find there are a whole lot of documents relating to the way we're thinking of breaking it down, 6.1, 6.2, etc. And there's also an introduction. So yeah, you're welcome to have a look at what other people are up to, either to pick up on whether they're doing something to do with data, or just to see how they're going about it.
Yes, I'm just looking at it now. Yeah.
Just to add, Nigel, I think the most constructive possibly way and quickest way to do this is to make challenge subsections if we want. So what are the challenges of data A, B, C, D, or 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, and that's the modeling structure, the structure of the modeling paper. And then basically write text within each of those and then trim it down and then see how that comes together. And it took us a while to get to that stage in the modeling paper. So I think maybe we can take that knowledge and kind of apply it here straight away and get on with doing that. Dennis, Valerie, what do you think?
I think yeah, I think the crucial thing is to get started, isn't it? To identify some fairly broad areas of where we see the challenges, and then to see whether those need to be subdivided or can be addressed as a single point.
And if you divide it into broad areas like that, it doesn't matter if it turns out that one of these broad areas you reckon at the end of the day actually just provides material for the introduction rather than specific challenges, whereas another broad area you've identified actually comes up with 3 crisp specific challenges. I think the important thing is the key thing is to get started, really.
Yeah.
And also I think that if you start with the notes in the order they just occur to you, we can argue later as to whether actually another order is a more sensible structure. Again, I think particularly, I mean, for the kind of thing we're trying to do, and particularly trying to do it remotely like this, I think to try and have a structure which is reasonably modular. So it is just a question of bits, which each one of which can be taken control of by 1 or 2 or 3 people, makes it much easier to write.
And there is a data section as well, isn't there, Ben? That some of it, I mean, maybe at the moment quite split into parts. That bit can just be populating a part here, and then we see where it fits, because we were thinking that might fit here better. Is that right, Ben?
Yeah, so I think it's 6.3 in the modeling folder, but yeah, it could equally go in this depending on. I think there's definitely some modeling aspects to it, but whether we put it in here and then just cross-references.
6.3, yeah, just looking at that now. Yeah.
So that's the intention is that there is having a modeling focus, but says almost the same things, and then here it has a data focus with the challenges. And
I mean, there's absolutely common ground there. You're looking at granularity, issues of data across models of different granularity. I mean, actually, you rapidly do keep coming back to some of these issues around policy, which is that we know that the UK administrative data landscape divides the country very differently, and actually just that is a huge challenge, kind of understanding.
Again, picking it up, Nigel, I mean, the politics and policy paper could very easily have a sort of policy, but I think in that paper I would try and make it a single challenge, data related challenges for policy, or something like that, and then that can be something that can be contributed to by the people of the more specialist papers. I mean, maybe that sorting out the barriers, where to draw the boundary between the modelling paper and the data paper might be more difficult, but I'm sure that can be.
Yeah, it probably is. I mean, I think there just will be areas where there is some overlap, but as you say, we're looking not to miss big areas that are consequential.
And I think it'll be interesting rather than a problem if you get almost the same challenge in the 2 different papers, say, but approached from 2 rather different ways of thinking about it.
Yeah,
I can't see anything wrong with that.
Yeah. So the just in terms of good order, in terms of this initial meeting, that kind of kicks off. I can certainly kind of reach out to other members of the workshop. We can use this as a starting core. Cara can kind of generate an initial kind of document around notes, but I mean, the sooner we kind of structure that into a set of top level themes that we think are material, the better.
Oh, sorry, no, actually, one other thing. Sorry, they're in at the top level in the Dropbox. There are a couple of spreadsheets for which haven't been changed for a while, but they're challenges table where their name starts. And the idea was to do was to help cross-referencing by having one which is called challenges table applications, which is from the point of view of the first 5 themes, and another from looking at it the other way from the methodologies point of view. And for some of them, we found it helpful to start, start making sort of bullet points of things in the table. But in all events, it's a way of it's meant to be a help in the cross-referencing. And of course, when you try to cross-reference things like that, you find that some things naturally cross-reference. So there's some particular challenge to do with data, which is very much to do with interventions. So there's an obvious place for it in that table. Others may be challenges to do with data which apply at all stages of pandemic, which are not so easily buttonholed. So it's got its limitations, but
in terms of other challenges, the environment, looking at that, for example, I mean, I say data is going to be a bit transverse across many of these. So there'll be a lot to kind of go through to kind of pull all of that together. Are there anything that you'd point us to be, other than we've talked about today, that would be particularly, that have already discussed a lot of data-related issues?
I don't think they've discussed them very much yet, because another group that hasn't sort of got very far with the discussions, but I guess the interventions. So, because, one can think, for example, of, I mean, the whole issue of trying to have the appropriate data to be able to judge the effect of intervention.
I do think that going through the stages of pandemic from environment through to endemicity is helpful in challenging data scientists as to making sure that whatever they come in with is relevant. I mean, I suppose the environment, its data problems are trying to help maintain a global surveillance structure in which data are available. I mean, you can imagine. I mean, one of the things I was wondering about, I was thinking that having data on respiratory diseases all across the world available in such a way that people can look for patterns in it and say there's something suspicious going on. There are strange cases of respiratory disease in, I don't know, let's say Thailand and Malaysia or whatever it is. I wonder if that's actually that these are not what they're being, they're being called cases of flu, but I wonder if they are. And of course, you could imagine, I mean, I don't know how conceivable this is, but you could imagine 10 or 20 years down the line that medics around the world testing people for respiratory diseases might take essentially genotype the virus, so which would suddenly bring a fuzzy picture into sharp focus. So
I mean, there has been some work
in talking about the future. We need to. I mean, I suppose that could well be scary from all sorts of data privacy points of view.
Yeah, well, come on. So that would definitely be an issue.
But actually, if it became standard around the world that if you went into your GP with a respiratory disease, they took a small sample and half an hour later they could tell you that what you had was such and such coronavirus type, such and such, it would suddenly make it so much easier to, obviously, to spot a new pandemic. So
yeah, there has been some work in veterinary science about what they call syndromic surveillance, so kind of just monitoring reports from veterinarians.
And one of our contributions was around the whole issue of the workshop was international collaboration and actually incentivization of people to do this, the incentivization. So of course, these aren't just unique to the challenge of infectious diseases, but and we wouldn't expect them necessarily. And pointing out their importance in the context of this challenge would be one of the key features, I think. Frank.
Yeah. But just a point. I mean, I suppose we share anecdotes of what's happened this time around. But in this country, we're very good at some bits of data science. Very good. I mean, for example, the whole genome sequencing and COG UK, that ability to look at the whole genome and to work out, for example, that the infections were primarily introduced from Italy and France and Spain early on. That ability is tremendous. However, we can't actually tell from that how people infect each other, because that you have the whole genome of the virus, but you have no epidemiological data concerned with it. You don't know anything about the person. You don't know anything about where they live or who they met or whatever. And making that kind of data linkage is critical. Now, of course, there are beginning to be studies of this. In Cambridge, the asymptomatic testing, the plan there is to have questionnaires of the students, get epidemiological data from them about where they were and this, that, and the other, and then use the whole genome sequencing of the phylogenetic tree to try and work out whether well, this isn't being minuted, is it?
No, but of course you can imagine exactly.
It's been recorded.
This will end up quite quickly.
What's the major super spreader event?
Yeah. Well, I think I think that's, for modelers, it is very frustrating that obviously what's happened with the people coming up with a case of COVID-19 and ending up in a hospital or whatever becomes the situation is overwhelmingly illness focused, that here's someone who's got a nasty disease, we must do our best for them, and gathering the data which might actually help you stop other people becoming infected is obviously a low priority. What you would look from a modeler's point of view or data collector's point of view, you would want everyone who comes in and is tested, or certainly if they're tested positive, to be subjected to a carefully focused set of questions determined to try and gather some information about how they came to be infected, so that you can, at least in very rough terms, it would have been helpful in the early stages to be able to say what percentage of, maybe for instance, to make some reasonably well-informed guess as to how many people were getting infected through going shopping, say, in supermarkets or whatever.
Yes, but I mean, we have. I mean, this is maybe too broad a thing for this particular report. But I think it's we should be aware of it, and it has certainly mathematical and statistical aspects. But several of the aspects concerned with privacy, concerned with aggregation of data, concerned with this, that, and the other, I think there is a challenge for the maths and stats community to ask the question the other way around. How can you make data accessible and useful, subject to constraints on privacy, and to sort of solve the problem? I mean, to give an example, and again, this isn't for minuting or anything, but in Cambridge, the Lighthouse Laboratory set up by the university and AstraZeneca was doing, the huge numbers of tests nationally. Yet for about a month, it was not possible for us to get the asymptomatic testing up and running, because it was going to be pooled testing. So there'd be 8 or 10 samples in one test. And it broke the data restrictions. I mean, when a sample went into the Lighthouse lab, it got a barcode on it, and that barcode became the point that Test and Trace used, and nothing more was known. So the university there wasn't a way to compassibly do a pooled test where you'd need to know who the 8 and 10 students were. They were all living in the same household or staircase. There wasn't a way that could fit within the Lighthouse Lab. And that kind of, you can see the reason for data privacy. You can see the reason for certain workflows being constructed certain ways. But there are solutions here, and they tend to be mathematical and statistical solutions that allow you to get both things. They allow you to be able to do, at certain levels and in certain ways, linkage of the epidemiological and the genome sequencing and the testing, while at the same time preserving privacy. I mean, we have very crude mechanisms that are used by government and by the ONS now. You don't give the data if it's less than 3 or some small number of units per cell. Some kind of crude things like that, I think, would probably work. Would probably be enough to say, okay, this is enough. This is a level of privacy, and given the emergency, we can cope with that level. I think there are challenges there for the mathematicians and statisticians and computer scientists to say, when push comes to shove and there's a real emergency, where are the ways you can relax the privacy thing without giving it away entirely?
No, this is being discussed quite widely, and I think it's a really interesting nuance we're seeing around the notion of moderating those traditional, kind of, oh, you can't possibly, you'll be kind of outed by the privacy lobby, whatever. I think there's a different, and there'll be some technical, logical approaches to that. There'll be some licensing and regulatory approaches to it as well. But there's also a change, I think, around sentiment in some of this. Actually, you can almost.
Right.
But,
also, there's a distinction here between handing over data you might not otherwise have handed over, provided you make certain modifications, sort of blurring of it, so as to. But I think you alluded earlier to the alternative, which is to keep the data private, but to allow a computer program that has been vetted to run on it.
Yeah.
But you just have to check that the computer program is not going to carry over details it shouldn't.
That's right. Yeah. And I think that's definitely going to be a component in what we do. I mean, just as realizing we've got about an hour left. I mean, I think the discussion, there will inevitably be, because also the people there and the amount of effort in it, a discussion of platforms and whatever we think of open epidemiology. I think it's important that we do think that what those efforts have discovered, where the challenges are. I think that's I think it's appropriate even for a journal rooted in if you like the biological sciences, that we have this sense of the software platform challenges that these kinds of systems generate. And the other thing is around data infrastructures, is this notion of readiness for repurposing, which is not to say it's just putting the data always before everything else, but even then we know there are some relatively straightforward things. I think that was the Dell discovery as well, observations that some relatively straightforward publication harmonization would have actually really helped. And simple stuff around comparability, around the ontologies that were being used for various bits of descriptors, even when they were coordinated by people like WHO, were not always very fit for purpose, because there wasn't a.
But I think it's a really interesting, it's a really hard, challenging use case that for the logical sort of mathematical issues concerned with things. The use case of, I've got the whole genome sequence and I need to tag it with epidemiological data. Because the genome sequence is hugely informative in all sorts of ways, and the epidemiological data you want is stuff like, which restaurants, where do they live, this sort of stuff. So it's really quite a hard case, because in each, in those two different areas that have to be linked per case, the two sets of information are so specific and so identifying. I mean, it's a really hard challenge.
We're doing the paper, aren't we now? I mean, definitely into the weeds on that, because I think it's a great challenge. It's a great challenge. It's a really important opportunity. Just give us a sense of, I guess Chiara will be assembling this. We should create a live Google Doc which we can kind of contribute in. That would be a first step. Start the thread together and organize it into the potential subsections, looking to those other efforts. I can see, of course, that some are rather more developed than others. I mean, we're not just I think we may be the only empty box, but I mean, everybody is kind of just in different states of maturation on this. What timescales are we looking at? Just give us a sense of where I mean, one or two of them are really well advanced, clearly. I mean, what's their ambition in terms of getting material together, timelines?
I'm not sure. In an ideal world, I think, you know, hopefully we'd be able to make, people will have a bit more time coming up, and maybe we can make some sort of significant progress over the next few weeks. But it is quite hard because everybody is so busy, and you know, and I think everybody's also very tired and needs a bit of a break. So it's a mix of everything.
Can I jump? So I think academics are quite relaxed with timelines in terms of actually getting it finished. But I think one thing they would like is sort of things like lead authors on papers and just ideas of titles. So I think the main priority I see for like trying by the beginning of January is really having a team together of people who are sort of agreed that they will put aside a bit of time to work on this at some point, and one person who's sort of taken on the role of, you know, leading the organization of chasing people up for writing bits and making sure everything comes together by January, I think is the kind of goal.
And I think one might add to that it would be nice to aim for having some kind of provisional list of challenges within each theme, even if it's very provisional, you know, so that we enter the new year with a clearly defined task for each theme. So, and obviously, for some of the challenges, I think we're almost pretty much there already. Others need a bit of work, but
yes, you were going to comment.
It seems to me from the discussion that you know, that I would hope we could make quite rapid progress in identifying at least some provisional spectrum of challenges.
I would hope so. I mean, given that you're variously on the call, colleagues, I'm hoping that we might be able to take some initial steps to kind of do the shaping between us, if that's okay, and just you know, treat it as a fairly free form exercise. I think we've heard just today, you know, 5 or 6 broad categories of interest, and they are not likely to be exhaustive at this point. I'm particularly, again, interested in the insights coming from those areas that are the consumers and producers of this, the data ecosystem that we choose that we're in or would love to see going forward. Yeah.
So one other thing we didn't mention, sorry, Nigel.
No.
The section in the 6.3 of the modelling paper that I mentioned earlier, the 4th bullet point in there is on surveillance data, which we haven't really mentioned yet.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah, perhaps I should.
Of all of them, that's probably the most relevant to this. You know, I don't think there's really a very strong modelling component to that at all, and we just put it there as a kind of placeholder, really, to probably transfer directly into this paper. And I think that's something, again, we've talked about in what kind of, particularly if we're looking towards future pandemics, as Dennis mentioned at the start, that surveillance data in the intervening times between pandemics is going to be something that we're particularly interested in, and what data we should be collecting.
Look, there are some very prosaic challenges there, which is that some of our best data is held by platforms that we think, well, I mean, I don't know, the experience with the mobile, with telcos has been, yes, sort of. They've handed some of it over under some conditions. Hasn't been terribly easy to use, it turns out, some of it. Some of it comes with rather prescriptive license, despite their kind of putting their hands up to say, look how wonderful we are. And at least in some cases, it's been recharged to different departments of state on multiple occasions, you know, even for the stuff that's apparently helping in the pandemic. I think there's some, depends how far you want also to use these as opportunities to make the case for some of these public goods that emerge from the data that is collected routinely by these sorts of platforms to be more accessible. There aren't sustained or maintained research relationships, even in situations like this. I think that's definitely one interesting, that did come up quite a lot, is that the licensing regimes that are in place, that are all set to expire at the end of December. What about them? You know, what does that even look like in terms of a prospect going forward? Yeah.
Another challenge, I guess, is knowing what data is going to be important, because probably our position now is very different to back in January, February time, where we didn't really know what the important drivers were and what the important.
Where is that? And is there any kind of crisp summarization of what we think our insights are on that? I mean, I kind of, or is it somewhat still sort of emergent from all the?
Well, I think it's one of the key challenges is to sort of figure out what data we need and how informative the data are.
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, that could be something. And I also think in terms of surveillance, I mean, I would quite like to see the paper going all the way from just figuring out what the data is through accessing it to figuring out what you can learn from the data, so how informative it is, and also at the far end, and maybe this is a sort of, you know, step too far in terms of practicality, but looking at more actually adaptive design of data collection, so where we're actually saying, okay, there's something happening, and we need to sort of process that allows us to learn about it as rapidly as possible and sort of deploy some of the technologies that we have in terms of data collection to figure out what's going on. So an example of that would be, you know, how do different interventions help? And you could imagine, you know, the government doesn't know, so they could imagine the government doing something like, well, we'll try intervention X here and intervention Y in another place, and then, you know, so I would quite like to see this paper sort of covering that, but maybe other people feel that would be for, you know, is for another challenge.
I think we should feel we can go as far as is intellectually rigorously.
Yeah, I mean,
I do think a lot of this will end up intercepting with the point Frank made right at the beginning, is that in the real world of policy, what it takes to be able to actually introduce A/B testing on the population in real time is, well, I mean, it's a question partly of.
But to some extent, I mean, maybe this reflects my background, but I mean, to some extent, I'm not. I don't feel we should be completely tied to reality as it currently is.
No.
We could be pointing out that there are opportunities that if all these things could be lined up, this could be the sort of thing that you could think about doing.
Okay.
And to some extent, it has happened anyway, just by accident.
So next steps then, Cara, if you share the notes with us, let's set up a Google Doc that we've all got access to. We will then also contact the wider group of people who are actually at the original workshop, and also try and put a little bit of shaping around the core challenges that we see, some of which we've identified today, and others will occur to us as we refactor and reshape that. We should make that our ambition for the relatively short term, if we can do that. Yeah, okay, good.
Should we do the Google Doc via Slack, so that people who want to find it can find, if they're signed up to the, we've got this slightly awkward dual.
Yes, I don't know how
we got the Dropbox, and it'd be nice to, as it were, print off the Google Docs from time to time and put an updated version in the Dropbox so people know what's going on. But we've also got a Slack working group thing, and
I don't know how
we can have a link to the Google Doc there.
Yeah.
Well, can I suggest that I send the Google Docs around to everyone that's on here, and then Nigel, you can send it on to any people from the workshop who you think would be relevant or have time to contribute. And then I'll also put it, Dennis, in the Slack channel for anyone who hasn't made it today.
Yeah, because not everybody will be inducted onto, we'll be routinely using that Slack channel either. I mean, there are some people who were a bit on the periphery who were nevertheless very valuable in the workshop who okay.
If anyone needs signed up to the group there, we can, you know, just let me know their name and email, and I can do that for both the Dropbox and Slack.
Great. Okay.
could I just ask, is there a plan to meet at this time next week? I mean, after that, presumably we'll stop for a week or two, but.
Yeah, so I think I didn't mention to Nigel, one thing we are also trying to do is have a regular meeting slot for these papers, so that they kind of, almost as a check-in, some are meeting more every other week, some every week for like just for 20 minutes, half an hour, just as a way to make sure that it doesn't fall, like, so that it kind of just a quick update from everyone to make sure that things are ticking over. So it might be worth, when, if you want to invite some additional people into this, Nigel, it might be worth then sending a doodle poll round and finding a time that might be best for most people.
Yeah, we're just up against it a bit, aren't we? Because next week is probably a lot of people after that date might find it challenging. I don't know whether there's an opportunity, whether we might try, if people were available, just for half an hour to reconvene
next Thursday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just next, just to see whether we've, and if we haven't moved ourselves on, we could just sit down with the Google Doc and make sure we move ourselves on at that point, you know.
Yeah.
Because it's, what do people think? Honestly, I'm keen to try and get this.
I think it'd be good to check back.
Yeah.
When we have something that's got something in it, we can just, as you say, maybe a long discussion, or maybe just a quick check. Yes, it's going fine. Any sort of clarification needed, whatever. But I think it'd be good to have a catch up.
What was the suggestion? Sorry, Kel, you made a suggestion on the date.
Well, I think next week, I think, was the.
Yeah, we can do same time next week, and then maybe at that point for the new year, if people want to, if we want to invite some additional people in, we could send a doodle poll round to make sure that there's a time that because if you wanted to invite some people from the workshop, Nigel, I was just thinking. Yeah,
let's do that. Okay, well, if we can check in, let's do that. Let's do that. So same time next week, and we'll certainly undertake to flesh out and try and categorize and structure the Google Doc that we're doing, and then we can think about reaching out to other people who were involved. But it's great to have the participation of people in the other papers as well. I mean, that really is going to be helpful. And I think the Delve, I don't know whether you've seen the data readiness report, other people on the call. It's worth taking a quick peruse of. I think it comes at it slightly differently, but I mean, there they were bruising their toe on some, Sage isn't quite, they were having requirements placed on in a different way. There was also a very interesting initiative that was a bit odd, that the joint academies were meant to be kind of trying to help support. This Emergent Alliance, did anybody know about this Emergent Alliance effort? This was the number 10's attempt to recruit the shiny world of commercial data analytics with all their spare processing and data analysts onto emergency problems for which answers were needed. And there was quite an interesting degree of tension, I have to say, between the importation of people who had lots of data analyst skills, but not the faintest clue on the EPI models being used, just simply generating models for the delectation of some of the advisors. And nobody was very sure on whether this had been sanity checked at all. Now, this is not, it is being recorded, but
only for private use.
Sounds like Dominic Cummings to me.
It created quite a challenge. Well, I couldn't possibly comment, but there was some of that going on, and there was a feeling that that they didn't want quite such a considered, reflective process that they were seeing coming out of some of the data analytics, and wanted answers like tomorrow for things for which there was insufficient data and little. Well, where can I say?
I think that, I think there are interesting questions to do with the sort of pandemic advisory structure, but they're perhaps best dealt with in the policy and politics paper.
Some of it was very data directed, really, Dennis. That's why I bring it up, because there were
no. I think it's a way of sorry. I should be saying it should be nice if you'd like to keep an eye on the policy paper and contribite to that.
Yeah, I think we had some conversations with some of those groups, and in the end, I think our initial conversations with them were along the lines of that they seemed to claim to have access to lots of data, but in the end, I think we realized they were probably having similar problems accessing the data that we were.
They did. Yeah, exactly. So yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so we'll reconvene. Thank you so much, and thank you for bringing us to